Hello, everybody. Today we're going to talk about hypothesis testing in a very general sense. In later videos, you can look at me do the detailed work of collecting data, verifying critical regions, and p-values. But I want to look at hypothesis testing in a very general sense, like I have here. First, you have a null hypothesis. This is kind of the current belief, what everybody believes. So let's say we're in a state of pandemic and we believe every person has the disease, whatever disease it is. So that's the current belief. So the alternative would be a person does not have the disease. So we start out, everybody has the disease until you can show to me, prove to me the alternative H1 that a person does not have the disease. So again, in the very beginning, you state your null, what is the current belief, and the H1, what you're trying to show. So what happens? Now you collect data, and from that data, you can make a conclusion. And it's either of two conclusions. You reject H naught, the null hypothesis, or you do not reject H naught. So what does it mean to reject H naught? Well, if you reject H naught, I have evidence of H1. What does that mean? I have evidence that a person does not have the disease. So that's very clear. What does it mean not to reject H naught? Let's think about that. Well, I do not have evidence that a person does not have the disease. In some respects, I support the claim they probably have it, but I didn't prove they have it. I want to make that very clear. When I do a do not reject, I'm not saying I proved H naught. I did not prove H naught, but my data supports H naught. I want to make that very clear. That I'm not, when I do a do not reject, I'm actually not proving H naught. What I'm doing is I'm supporting the fact that potentially it is true. I always got to make that very clear when we talk about hypothesis tests. It's a very key cornerstone of hypothesis testing and its power. All right, now that you've made your conclusion, each of these conclusions could be wrong. And if they're wrong, we bring in what we call type 1 and type 2 error. So what is type 1 error? Well, type 1 error, we reject when it's actually true. Well, down here we rejected. So if we follow the stream, the error made would be a type 1 error, because if you look above, the type 1 error is when you reject, but it's actually true. Well, look at what we said here. Let's say you made the conclusion, I have evidence that a person doesn't have the disease. What could be the error? Well, they actually have it. The person actually has the disease. And that would be a type 1 error because you came out and said, I reject. I have evidence the person doesn't have it. But down the road, the test came out as a negative, but really it was a positive. Wow, some big issues, right? Let's look at error 2. Well, what is error 2? Well, error 2 is you do not reject when actually it's actually false. So let's look at this. I don't have evidence the person does not have the disease. What this really means to me is the person, so if you do not reject H naught, that means most likely the person has the disease. But in truth, the person does not have the disease in this case. You would lend support. So if you're doing I do not reject H naught, it kind of lends support that they have the disease, but you're not guaranteeing it with the test you have. So what's the error in that statement? The error in the statement would be, well, you have support that the person has the disease. That's a problem. Because what if in the end you get a more comprehensive test and it comes out the person does not have the disease? Now, both of these errors, type 1 and type 2, are very bad. The question is, which one's worse? Right? We say, oh, you don't have the disease, go back to work, and then that person spreads the disease big time because you made the mistake and the person actually has the disease. Or saying, no, I think you have evidence you have the disease, and then you go to the stronger test and you realize, oh, okay, we were wrong, you don't have the disease. Which of these is worse? Well, to me, Error 1 is worse because we let a person with a disease out in the public to spread it more. Number 2, okay, depending on the time of which we can get to the better test, that person's life is turned upside down. They're quarantined, stuff of that nature. Their liberties are withheld. This is a bad case too. Both of these are bad cases. Somebody could definitely talk about in an ethics class, in a psychology class. Awesome classes. But in this case, I just want to make you understand what it means to go through a hypothesis test. Straight from making your null and alternative hypothesis, pretending to collect data, in this case probably would be some type of test, blood test. From there, you make 2 conclusions potentially. And once you make a conclusion, there's always a chance that you could be wrong. And that's where the type 1 and type 2 errors come from. They come from the chances the hypothesis test is wrong. Now, we can actually control type 1 by making sure our test is very, very rigorous. All right? That's where the alpha comes in. It's called the level of significance. The alpha value, you'll hear it talk to me. I'll talk about and explain about in future videos. The level of significance. This is actually the probability of type 1 error. And that's important to know. So whatever error is the worst, we try to put in the type 1 error because we can really do a good job of controlling the type 1 error by setting down a level of significance. The type 2 error is not as easy to control and not as easy to calculate. It can be done, but it's not as easy to calculate. There are a lot of facts one can read about the type 1 and type 2 errors, and I implore you to look into those. All right, why don't you pause the video and see how you do in the next example. And we're back. So what do we got in our next example? We have the null hypothesis. A accused person is innocent. Well, that makes sense, right? That's our jury system, right? Right away, if I'm on the jury, I have to believe the accused person is innocent, period. The alternative is the person is guilty. Well, what happens? Well, now comes the trial, right? And there's data collected. And my job as a juror is to sit there and read. And then I get 2 things to state, 2 conclusions I can pick from at the very end. What is it? Well, first is I reject H not. What does it mean to reject? That means I have evidence that the person is guilty. There is enough evidence to show that the person is guilty. Vice versa, if we're not rejecting H not, remember, in the system, in the court of law, we don't say, oh, you're innocent. What do we say? We say you are not guilty. And that's really what it is I have no evidence that the person is guilty. I don't know if the person is innocent. We find them guilty or not guilty. That's very important. Again, a very important a key ingredient to me is I do not know if you're truly innocent, but there is not enough evidence that has been submitted to me that the person is guilty. And that's how we do it is I have evidence the person is guilty. You show me no evidence that the person is guilty. Guilty, not guilty. That's how we do this. Notice we don't show innocence. All right, so what are the errors made? Well, if we reject H not, that means we found evidence the person is guilty. Got it, guilty. Then they have some kind of punishment. Later down the road, oops, we made a mistake. And the mistake would be a type 1 error, and that mistake is the person is actually innocent. Well, I don't know about you. I don't like making a habit of sending a guilty person to jail. So this type 1 error is extremely bad. Sending a guilty person to jail or to punishment when they're actually innocent is a very bad thing. And this is kind of how our United States, our American system works. Type 2 error is bad in some instances, but overall type 1 is usually the worst error. But I can understand, and that's, again, if you go to ethics class, psychology class, sociology class, you deal with, there are times type 2 errors seem to be worse. So what do we mean by type 2 here? Well, type 2 here is I have no evidence the person is guilty. So what happens to them? They're not guilty, they go free. But in the end, the person is actually guilty. And that's bad too. I mean, sending in guilty person out with freedoms intact is not a good thing. But I stand true to my, my moral compass, I guess. I really don't want an innocent person in jail. I really don't like that. But I can see how this would be bad too. A really bad person, they're not innocent. They're not guilty. And so we actually get them out, and then that person is guilty, and they commit another crime, and we could have stopped that. Well, hopefully, this won't happen if we collect the right data and we have the proper check marks in place. That's the hope. But as we know, sometimes court systems don't work up to their levels. All right, guys, thank you for, watching my first video into the introduction of hypothesis testing. Stay tuned for where we actually spend time right in here, collecting the data, analyze the data. And that's the important part to me, is analyzing the data to make sure I can pick the right conclusion, which will hopefully minimize the errors. Because sometimes these errors can be really, really bad.